but sorry for the pause. But the Autism Society of North Carolina was involved with the legislative study to bring around training to include law enforcement, EMS, fire, and bring our families and your jobs closer together. So whenever I'm presenting, we want to sort of start off to think about the people with autism that you may have met, or maybe you are seeing pictures of some people with autism for the first time. And I like people to think about what you've seen or experienced if you've met someone with autism. Or what do you see as you look at these pictures here? And most of the time, the response is that, you don't really see anything, especially out of the ordinary. And in fact, we know that autism impacts children and it impacts adults, and it impacts girls and boys, though we do see more boys than girls with a diagnosis of autism. And that we not only does it affect both genders, but also all races, socioeconomics, and different regions all across the country. So in the world. So it's not something that we can just see and know that autism is present. So a couple things, quick quiz, true or false, think about it yourself, but autism affects each person very differently. Is that true or false? And the answer is, it is true. It does impact everybody differently, and we're going to talk about how those differences might look. And autism is a mental illness, true or false? And the answer is, that is false. It is a developmental disability, and I will talk more about that in a moment. And finally, people with autism are 7 times more likely to have contact with first responders than anyone else, true or false? And that is true. My own son in his lifetime has had probably 6 different times where first responders have been involved for a variety of reasons. Everything from medical, when he had his first seizure at the age of, I think he was 8, to he's been lost 3 times. He also had a difficult interaction with his sister out in the community. And that wasn't a first responder. That was actually a security person, but who intervened before I got there. So, these are things that have been part of our world. So what is autism? Well, autism is a neurobiological disorder of the brain. So it affects how the brain develops, and that difference causes differences in the way information is processed. So I want you to think about your brain and how it works and how it informs your body with what to do. So we take information into our brains through our senses, and we also have thoughts that come into our brains. And our brains take that information, identify what's coming in, and process it, for lack of a better word, since that's what we're talking about. And then it informs your body in some way to do something. It might tell you to say something. It might tell you to do something. It might tell you to move a certain way. So imagine if you were looking at your screen, listening to me, and all of a sudden, really bright lights start flashing out of your computer screen. Your brain would process that information probably as distracting at best, or maybe even painful to your eyes, and you might close your eyes or look away. And that happens in a split second. But imagine if your brain took in information and it didn't, it read it, but there was no output path, no response. So I think about, like, if I call my son's name, but he didn't answer when he was little. My son was diagnosed when he was 3. So that was something we saw a lot. And it was like, almost like it hit a dead end. That information, he heard his name and he was like, oh, that's my name. And then he might hear it again. He's like, oh, mom's so smart. She knows my name. But there was no response. Nothing in his brain was telling him that he should say what, or turn around and look at me, or here I am, or anything like that. So that's a possible thing that the brain is doing. It's also possible that that information goes into the brain, but it goes to, or it gets identified in the wrong way. So let's say you're touching something hot, but your brain understands it as cool. Then you may not move your hand away the way you should if it were hot. And so that results in maybe we see a behavior that is not what we're expecting with that input. It is maybe even inappropriate for that input. And that applies to thoughts as well, right? We might hear somebody say something and we interpret it one way, so we respond the way we've interpreted it, but really that was not what was really said, or that was not really what the thought should have resulted in. So that's another difference that may be happening. And then we also may see a difference in how long that information takes to get from one point to another. So let's say you hear something or you see something, but it takes your brain a really long time to identify what it is and then actually get to a place in the brain that tells you what to do that is appropriate. So there's a delay in that response. And we actually use the term sort of clinically, processing speed as a measure of cognitive ability. And we see that often different for people with autism. So if you ask a person a question, they may understand your words, but it may take them longer to understand it, and then longer still to get their body to respond to what you've just said, if whether it's giving a direction or asking a question. And that delay may be something that you experience because of the brain difference associated with autism. And so all these differences that are happening in the brain, we can't see them. And we can't even do a brain scan to look at them. The only way to measure them is by looking at a collection of behaviors associated with a bunch of different areas. And that's these areas that are on this slide. And I'm going to cover them in some detail as we go forward. But we look at the behaviors associated with understanding and using language to communicate. We look at how an individual might relate to people or events or objects in the environment. We might look at how they're processing and responding to sensory stimuli. And we look at their thoughts, how they're thinking and interpreting information and concepts, and how it compares to typically developing people. And so a collection of behavioral differences is how we diagnose autism. And autism is a spectrum disorder. In 2013, we actually came to calling it autism spectrum disorder to encompass a broad range of characteristics from mild to needing to, I guess, severe, for lack of a better word. And when we indicate the level of autism an individual may have, we're referring to the amount of support that they require due to the differences in how their brain is processing information. So level 1 would be the mildest, so to speak, requiring some support, but certainly not, ongoing day-to-day support. Level 2 is going to be requiring more substantial support, and that may be somebody who needs, maybe day-to-day support, but it doesn't have to be necessarily that an individual is glued to them every day. But there may be a lot of strategy supports that are in place. And then level 3, requiring very substantial support, a lot of strategies, and a lot of one-on-one personal support that may be needed to help in certain circumstances. So, people don't move back and forth through this, but we can see some progress for some individuals, depending on some other factors, meaning other diagnoses that come with the autism sometimes, um, as to how much we're able to develop greater and greater levels of independence. And that's what we're always looking for when we're helping somebody with autism, is how can we give them yet another step toward independence, or agency, or autonomy. So that spectrum again refers to the levels of support. Um, and those levels of support will vary from setting to setting. So we can be in different environments and need different levels of support. So sometimes, and this is actually pretty frequent, there are a lot of folks with autism that may do well when they are in school because of the structure of school. But then as they move out of school into the adult world, a lot of that structure has to be kind of self um, actualized, and it just doesn't happen. And so we see sometimes they suddenly seem more impacted, um, because those supports have gone away. That structure has gone away. There's not a schedule with bells ringing all day long, indicating when you move from one activity to the next. And here's when I eat, and here's when I get to talk to my friends. And then, that all that structure disappears. So sometimes we see uh, needing more support at that time. Sometimes they may have different skills in different areas. And so while they may need more support, maybe with organizational skills, they don't need a lot of support in sensory regulation, or vice versa. So again, it will vary from person to person. But when we look at their support in their day-to-day lives, to know that every individual will need some help, or some degree of help, um, to move on with their day. Um, and so that's how we're looking at autism, is that degree of support. And these are just some of the areas that we're looking at as we think about what kinds of support they need, what level of autism they may have. Um, and I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The communication, I'm going to talk about social interaction, thinking and learning, and then the sensory processing. But the sensory processing, I will note, actually has a huge impact on pretty much everything else, but that emotional regulation and behavioral patterns especially. So executive functioning refers to those organizational level skills that impact problem solving, um, time management, as well as social interactions, the volley of communication and conversation, those sorts of things. All these things end up getting intertwined. And again, for any given person, they might have, some strengths associated with communication, as well as some deficits associated with communication, or, strengths associated with social interaction, but also challenges. And so you just see a ton of variation, and everybody looks a little bit different. Just to give you a more concrete example, I'll use my own son because that's my best teacher. But, my son has a ton of language. So he's always been able to talk, and he's had an incredible vocabulary. But his ability to communicate his wants and needs is, when he was very young, was very low. He wasn't using language to communicate his wants and needs, and he didn't have the words to say the things that he needed to say. He just could label things. So we had those differences in communication. And we see other things, like he doesn't look at you when you're talking to him, or he might even walk away while you're in the middle of a sentence, because he has a thought and his brain is processing that thought, um, and he can't listen to you anymore. He needs to just deal with what he's thinking about. So you start seeing that these things also don't operate in isolation as well. They overlap. So I want to talk a little bit about characteristics you might see as we go through this presentation this evening. But if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. A quote from Stephen Shore, who I've actually is a person with autism I have met. I actually got the opportunity to introduce him at our conference one year, but I had met him initially when he was first diagnosed back in, I guess it would have been the late 90s, which is when my son was diagnosed as well. And I met him online in a AOL chat room or something, just trying to get support. But autism today, if you've met somebody with autism, is probably that question is way more likely today than it was back in 1996 when my son was diagnosed. Today, 1 in 36 children born will be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, different from the 1 in 5,000 when my son was diagnosed 28 years ago. And we don't know why, right? We don't know what causes autism. There's not a single cause that has been identified. There's not even a single cause, there are some things that people are looking at, but one of the things that's complicating the research is the genetics. It seems that there is a genetic predisposition for autism, but the genetic complexity is very high. So over 100 genes are associated with autism, and any single individual is not going to have all 100 of them, right? So they may have 60 of them, or they may have 47 of them, but the degree and the combinations that you have is the reason why we have so many different presentations of autism, and everybody seems a little bit different. So that's why it's so complex. And it's one reason why it's been hard to sort of pinpoint what causes autism, because genetically all these individuals are so different. So when we look at those questions of is there a association with vaccines or with certain foods, for instance, or environmental factors, as if we look at the whole autism community together, there's so many different genetic phenotypes, it's hard to say what's causing it. So I think when we learn more about the genetics and we can say, okay, well, there's a definitely group of people with autism who, also have these kinds of sensory issues and this kind of epilepsy, and sleep disorders, which I'm just throwing out just some things that might co-occur with autism. Then, now we're going to look at, food allergies and are there impacts there, right? So the science is still evolving as we try to get answers to that. But at the same time, there are a lot of folks with autism who are just super comfortable with the idea that, my brain works differently, and that's my experience, and I'm a perfectly okay person, and I'm here and I'm ready to work and I'm ready to be your friend, and that's where neurodiversity comes in, and people with autism are just part of that diversity that we see and experience in our communities and at work and at church or in your neighborhood, and autism is right there as part of that neurodiverse community. So, we are certainly, I think at the Autism Society of North Carolina, 100% respectful of the way of being autistic, and not really determined to get rid of the autism as much as we are helping you find a way to feel good in your skin, to be successful, to struggle less, be supported more, learn skills that serve you well and help you achieve your goals. And that's true for children as well as teenagers, as well as adults. But there certainly are, a lot of differences across these different skill domains. And some people are able to develop skills that allow them to live quite independently and have meaningful, relationships. I'm actually supporting a number of autistic adults and their autistic children at this stage, which is really interesting to me and a big change that I've seen over the years. And then there are some people with autism who, still need that level 3, a great deal of support. They may also have an intellectual disability. Doesn't mean they're not able to gain skills, though, and make progress and be happy contributing members of the community. So when we think about autism, we're thinking about these 4 main areas. When we're diagnosing autism, we are looking at these 4 areas and all the behaviors that are associated with each of them to be able to make that diagnosis. In order to be diagnosed, you really have to show some level of difference in all of these areas. Now, the differences may be very subtle for some. So some of our, level 1s may be able to interact socially pretty well, but maybe only under certain circumstances. And so, that may seem pretty subtle, but there's something there in all 4 of those areas when we're diagnosing somebody with autism. So I want to take some time to go into them in a little more detail so that as you're thinking about people you meet, you may be able to identify where this might fit in with autism. So some people with autism, first of all, we think about communication. I want you to think not only about talking, but also the idea that it is about getting your wants and needs expressed to someone else. You can do that in nonverbal ways as well as verbal ways. So just because someone cannot talk, it doesn't mean that they can't communicate. And just because somebody does talk, it doesn't mean that they can communicate. So, and that was interesting for me as a parent because my first child was very verbal and was a terrible communicator as a child. So we just tantrumed all the time. And he was diagnosed with autism. My second child was actually nonverbal for a prolonged period of time, but she was a fantastic communicator. And so I didn't worry about it too much. And she started talking before she turned 2, which is actually pretty late. So, to see that difference was really very interesting. So some people with autism may have no vocal language whatsoever. Some may have, some words that they say or sounds that they make, and people who know them well might know what those things mean, but somebody meeting them for the first time may not. But we continue through that continuum again, because there's always that gradation. We may meet people who have a lot of language or be quite verbal, let's say. And some of it may be very canned or scripted language. So reciting, my son used to recite passages from books that he had memorized, or like an entire episode of SpongeBob. He still does this today, though it's not SpongeBob anymore. But that canned language may be part of that verbal communication. But some of our folks are using sign language. They might use pictures to communicate, or maybe use a device that they push buttons and talk that way. And they may have just a couple buttons, I want, or buttons that say the foods that they want, or pictures of the foods that they want, or the clothing they want to wear. So it can be just a limited number of pictures or signs, or images on a device, or it can be more extensive. Some of our folks may respond to directions or requests inappropriately, or just not respond at all. And that was, going back to where I started talking about the brain, that the way the brain is processing information may impact the kind of response that you receive when you give a direction or make a request of some sort. So that's something you may experience. They may not be using their face for facial expressions. If you think about the number of muscles that are in your face, there's quite a few. I don't know the exact number, but it takes a great deal of muscle coordination to make your to smile. In fact, we have a million different ways we can smile. I can smile like this. I can smile with my teeth showing. I might even laugh and smile. Those are all different things, and it's a lot of muscle coordination. And for some people with autism, their brains can only handle so many things at once. And so that also will impact a lot of what you see. They may have to focus on one thing and not another. So they may not be using their face to communicate that nonverbal kind of communication because they're really focused on getting a word out or picking the right picture or something like that. If they do talk, some folks with autism may have a robotic or monotone voice. I know my son's voice is sort of booming, very loud, and kind of sounds a little bit angry sometimes. And it partially because he just cannot control it in any other way. We also see communication wise a lot of repetition in the language of some folks with autism. So they may repeat things over and over again. It could be words, it could be phrases. They might ask a question over and over again. You've already answered it, but they're going to ask you again. Or they may just say a word over and over because, when they hear that word, the part of their brain that hears it registers that as delight, and they want to hear it over and over and over again. So a lot of people with autism, I'll share an analogy with you that I use a lot. It's something that my son and I actually came up with together. And it is that imagine that an individual with autism has an imaginary hula hoop around their body so that everything inside the hula hoop matters and everything outside, not so much. And so it makes sense for a lot of reasons, this analogy. The first is that the word autism, the root of it, is auto, which means self. And so that's the perspective of the person with autism. It doesn't mean that they're selfish, but it does mean that their thoughts, their thinking, their awareness comes from the self, from themselves primarily. And so when I think about the repetition, for instance, and how the hula hoop can help us understand it, I think about the hula hoop as representing the present, right now in time. And anything that happened in the past, we're not thinking about, and we're not able to sort of see what's to come next. So a lot of people with autism have a heightened level of anxiety because they're not necessarily able to anticipate what's expected of them or when they're going to get to do something that makes them feel good. And so they're constantly looking for ways to control the situation so they can feel less anxious. And so repetition, whether it's in language or other behaviors, is a way to control a situation, control the input into my brain, meaning themselves, so that they feel a little calmer maybe or less anxious. So I'm going to bring that back up again as I go through all these characteristics, but repetition is something that, it's predictable, right? If I ask you a question and you answer it and I ask you that question again, I know what the answer is. It's predictable. That makes me feel better. I'm going to ask it over and over and over again because that routine now is, I know it's reliable and I know how it's going to go. So that makes me feel better. Or I say a word and it makes me feel good. I want to do that over and over again. So we see that repetition come up with autism a great deal. They also have a hard time understanding and interpreting the facial expressions, body language of other people. You're not in the hula hoop. They're not paying attention or looking at you for that information if they're trying to listen to you. So remember, we're talking about the brain and maybe not necessarily being able to do a lot of things all at once. We may have to just do one thing at a time. And so if I'm listening, I can't also look at you for that nonverbal communication. So they're not looking at your face or your body language to get more information. They may also have a hard time communicating needs or details. And again, bringing back that hula hoop, when I think about the details of a situation, the situation is no longer in the present. It happened in the past, especially when it comes to first responders, people who are supporting them in a difficult situation. I'm feeling really distressed because something happened in the past, but because they're not in the past anymore, they're not necessarily thinking about it. They're just dealing with the feelings. And we'll talk about thinking, but that may be part of why they're having a hard time communicating those details. They may also not know what is relevant to communicate, what you're looking for. So they may just be overwhelmed by that thought. They may appear not to be listening or caring about what you're saying or doing, maybe in their own thoughts. And they may also seem very argumentative or stubborn in their communication. And again, they are thinking about their thoughts. They're not necessarily putting themselves in your shoes or understanding the entire situation, just focusing on their own needs at that time and what they think they need in order to feel better. So we do see a lot of this understanding and using language literally when they are using language. So if you say something like, "You're pulling my leg," they might think that you're actually pulling their leg. I know a new employee showed up at my son's workplace, and he was being very sarcastic with his language, and it really confused my son, and it caused him a lot of distress. And he's a college educated man. So just because somebody is smart, it doesn't mean that that translates to this practical functional language component. And that's easy to mistake. They may also have a hard time asking for help or clarification, knowing they may know that I'm stuck, but they don't know what is it that's making me stuck. Why don't I understand this? Or what is it that I need help with? And they may indicate that they do understand something, even if they don't. And some of that might be, just wanting to be done with whatever interaction they're having. They want it to stop. So they'll just, you say, "Do you understand?" And they'll just be like, "Yep." And that way this is going to stop. And not really solve the problem. So socially, you can see that this might be difficult if communication is difficult. But in your roles, they may not recognize the presence of authority figures, especially if there are badges or uniforms in place that they might see. Again, they're not necessarily looking or taking that in. They may not know what is expected in a situation where authority figures are present. They might have been used to it in school, but not necessarily out in the community. And of
Uh-oh, Nancy, we lost you. You froze up and then your picture disappeared too. I don't know if you can. Oh, I think we lost her.
Oh.
Oh, wait, I hear a voice maybe.
Okay.
I hear you. There you are.
I'm here, but it
Yep.
stopped sharing.
It did.
So let me go back to sharing.
Okay. While you're doing that, we have one question in the chat. Can I ask you that?
Yeah, go right
So
ahead.
Chris wants to know, how can we calm someone on the spectrum down? A lot of times I've encountered where they are overstimulated and either shut down, or it says STEM, and I'm not sure what that means, especially in a high.
Stimming. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm actually gonna cover that
Oh,
as we
okay,
get
great.
through
It
this.
says
So
especially
you
in a
got
high
it.
stress. All right, so you're going to cover that then.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thanks for the
Absolutely.
question, Chris. She'll
First, I
get
want
to.
to overwhelm you with characteristics.
Oh, it's
So,
great. This is all very interesting. Loving it.
okay, good. So, um, and it is a lot of describing somebody with autism. I think I will tell you, as somebody who lives, well, not anymore, day in and day out with someone with autism. My son moved out a year and a half ago, but um, that really understanding thoroughly his diagnosis and how he's impacted by autism helps me do the kind of problem solving that you're asking. What do I do? What do I do? I think if I just tell you what to do, you won't know what part of the autism you're addressing, how it's helping. So that's why I spend a lot of time on this section of the talk, but I will get to strategies, I promise. So I hope that makes sense. Um, Socially, again, you may see them seek social contact in unusual ways. Um, you may see that they have a hard time reading the room, and so they're missing those social cues. Again, think about that hula hoop. They're not paying attention to what's going on around them. They might hear the words that somebody is saying, but they're not looking at their facial expression. So they're not necessarily seeing that they're done with the conversation, that they're no longer interested in what you have to say about octopus anymore, right? And so they're not picking up on those cues, and it can create some friction in a social situation. They may not necessarily know what the social norms are, what's the expected behavior in a certain environment, or situation, if they haven't been explicitly taught. They may have a hard time recognizing people out. You meet somebody in one location and then you see them somewhere else. And I think we all go through that, right? You see somebody, from work when you're at the grocery store and you're like, oh, it's you. And you look different because you're in your weekend clothes instead of your work clothes. Well, they have an even harder time with that kind of facial recognition and knowing who's who outside of a situation. They may have a hard time with perspective taking, putting themselves in somebody else's shoes, and that hula hoop again. We call that theory of mind, being able to say, oh, if I do this, that person's going to be upset, or that person's going to be happy. And so they may do things without thinking of how they may impact somebody else. And that includes not only things they might say, although people with autism, a lot of them are sort of famous for not having a filter and just saying what they think. But they may also not be respecting personal space, maybe getting too close because they are bringing somebody into the hula hoop, or maybe thinking somebody's or something, an object, is theirs because it's in their hula hoop. So I think about like people who might walk through a store and touch everything, pick it up, look at it when really it needs to stay on the shelf, right? They may not understand the concept of personal property. I see this sometimes with, I guess I was just explaining the personal property, with touching everything. I know we see that a lot with kids when they're younger. Maybe somebody else has, I don't know, they brought Cheetos and my mom never sends Cheetos. So they just reach over and grab one, and not realize that you can't just help yourself to somebody else's food off their tray. Um, and there's that very honest or blunt, um, because we're not perspective taking. We're not thinking about how our words or actions might impact somebody else. This third area, this behavior and sensory responses, this really speaks directly to that brain processing, although it's not exclusively limited to it when we think about behavior. But that sensory information's coming in, and it could be very overstimulating stimulating. It can be very understimulating. I do think about the hula hoop again with sensory information coming in. Sometimes it gets sort of intensified inside the hula hoop. And so for some of our folks, they may just shut down because they're overwhelmed sensory wise, or they might melt down, in which case you'll see that big time, right? So because it's just too much information. I know, if I was talking too fast, saying too many things, and there's a lot going on, my son would be like, it's too much information. And we'd need to just sort of shut it all down, pick one thing to focus on, and start again, right? They may engage in repetitive behaviors. Somebody talked about stemming. It actually comes from stimulatory behavior or self-stimulatory behavior, or sometimes it's called stimming. But these are behaviors that will it's their full body input type things. So this is where we get pacing or bouncing, finger flicking, hand flapping, doing things with their heads. All of it is sort of doing something. Usually it's positive in some way in the brain. So either it's enjoyable and so we do it a lot, or it's because by doing it, it helps our brain quiet down and regroup. Or it can be, I know my son sometimes does these things when his brain is so delighted or excited by something, it can't just think it. It has to have the whole body react. And he bounces up and the fingers start going and he's pacing and back and forth and very happy. So those are different reasons why you might see that kind of behavior. We also see some unusual responses to pain for some of our folks, or a lack of response to pain for some of our folks. So again, thinking about how that information goes into the brain and it has to register as in some way or another in the brain to inform the body what to do. So if there's a lack of response to something that should be painful, then we're not going to see the behaviors associated with being in pain. And so that can be a problem. We do see that oftentimes folks are very easily overwhelmed, and that can result in some impulsive or aggressive behaviors, elopement behaviors, just trying to get through that feeling of being overwhelmed. Especially, or even if somebody is verbal, it doesn't mean they're able to, in that moment, once they're overwhelmed, be able to say what they need or how they feel. And so they are left with very rudimentary behaviors. And that's where that impulsivity or even aggression or elopement can come, where those are just that fight or flight kind of reaction to deal with communicating what it is that they're experiencing. That can be something that I think you all will see now and then because of your role. We also will see sometimes that lack of eye contact, maybe staring or avoiding looking at you. Again, that could be more information than they can take in at any one time. And then new situations can be very difficult. So again, back to that hula hoop and thinking about it almost being like a barrier to seeing what's next. Anything that's new and unfamiliar becomes unpredictable. We don't know how to interact with it, what we're supposed to do, what are expectations for us. And as a result, anxiety builds. And so change can be very difficult for individuals with autism, and they really gravitate toward routines, familiarity. Some of them do enjoy novelty, doing something new, but they still crave predictability even in that. So for instance, my son enjoys when we travel as a family, but he still wants a schedule. So when will I eat? And when will we do this? And when will we do that? And, we still have our communication tools so that he can tell me if he needs a break. And right. So we have all these supports for him in that new situation so he can enjoy the newness of it. But before we had all that, new situations were extremely stressful, and much more challenging for us as a family and for him. They may have a hard time, so if we change up what we're doing, or whether it's expectations or their routine, that can result in some difficult times. And then finally, there is that thinking and learning component that we're also going for. So some of our folks are very rigid in their thinking, that everything has to be a certain way, again, to sort of keep that emotional thermometer, so to speak, in low anxiety mode, so we know what's predictable. That's a big thing for a lot of our people. If they may have a hard time telling what's relevant versus what's irrelevant in a given situation, because they're not necessarily taking in everything going on around them, just what's in that hula hoop. And what's important to them may not be important to you, or to the situation at hand. So I always sort of think of, they're detail people, um, and they're not like the parts to whole kind of people. They're not seeing the big picture, just some of the details, and they may get stuck on the details. So I might be having a serious conversation with my son, but if I misspeak and say the wrong word, now he's done with my conversation because all he can think about is the wrong word that I said. And now we're go down another rabbit hole in a different direction. So, that can be really challenging. And then when I think about it, they tend to be very concrete thinkers just as a whole. And so abstract concepts are very challenging. Time is one of several abstract concepts that we deal with on a regular basis. And so their concept of time can be quite impaired. How long have you spent doing this? Or how much time until this is done? Or, um, how much time till I get to do, what I want to do. So it's important to think about people with autism really experiencing the world differently, than you do or I do. And their responses to things are going to be different. Certainly, each person with autism is uniquely affected by their autism. And, as you in your role start to support, and you already are supporting, I know, individuals with autism in a multiple set of ways, being aware of these differences will help you use different approaches and pick out which approaches may be most appropriate for a given individual, so that we can help them get to a point where things are more safe, where they are feeling better about the situation. So that's why we always talk about, we have to understand this person with autism through the lens of autism. Um, why are we seeing the behaviors we are seeing right now? We always sort of talk about any behavior that you see, in a way, it's communicating something, and we need to figure out what is it that it's communicating, this unmet need that needs to be met. It could be a communication challenge, with what they understand or what they're able to express. It could be, them not reading the social cues or understanding the perspectives of others. They may be having a hard time telling you what they need, or they may have feelings that are overwhelming or scary for them, whether it's anxiety or feeling really sad or overwhelmed. They can be quite, as we've described, inflexible or very rigid in both their thoughts and their patterns of behavior. Those executive functioning skills, may be impaired to impact how they organize their thoughts or their materials. Even something as simple as asking, somebody to find something in their pockets may be challenging when they're in distress. And they may have a hard time self regulating. I know for a lot of folks, they're not necessarily aware that they're doing sort of some things. My son just went on 2 different job interviews, and on one of his job interviews, he had a job coach with him. And one of the interviews, they were showing him different tasks that he might do at the store, and he was listening and watching sort of, but then he would walk away and flap his hands and think and come back. And his job coach told him later he might have done that a lot, and he said I wasn't even aware that I was doing it. And it is something he does kind of involuntarily. But if we give him support, sometimes we can help him find that way to self-monitor, right? So she didn't give him the support for that in that moment. That was okay. He went on 2 interviews. He got 1 job, so we're good. Another thing that maybe impacted joint attention is when we're paying attention to the same thing. So you see something and you point it out, and now I am drawn in by that and I look at it. Or I see something and I show you, hey, check this out, and you follow along. So with autism, we may not be doing something like that. And shifting attention, another challenge is those transitions from one thing to the next. So I think about individuals with autism, if our brains are like cars that can take multiple different routes to get from point A to point B and have a lot of flexibility in how they travel, a person with autism's brain is more like a train stuck on tracks. And so you can't just go like change your mind and go somewhere else if your train track brain is on train tracks. You have to wait until there's a track that goes there. And so shifting attention, moving from one thing to the next for someone with autism can be extra difficult. We've got to lay down extra track for them to get there, so to speak. There are strategies for doing that. And then, we've got to consider their sensory processing challenges as well. So there's just a lot to think about. It is a complex disability in a lot of ways, and it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things. And on top of that, there are co-occurring conditions. So 70% of people with autism have one comorbid mental health disorder. Co-occurring would be another word for that. And up to 40% have 2 or more. So my son has multiple diagnoses, not just autism. And so that's pretty common in the autism community. The big ones are anxiety, ADHD, depression, and then we may see things. There's like central auditory processing disorders, sensory processing disorder, and then additionally, medically, you get things like sleep disorders and epilepsy. My son had both of those, low muscle tone. So a lot of additional co-occurring challenges related are common with people with autism. And then, we may also see diagnoses of psychopathology less frequently in folks with more severe autism. And part of it is because we're just not looking at it as much, because the autism may be so pervasive, sometimes with a co-occurring intellectual disability. that we're not necessarily detecting the autism or the anxiety or ADHD, but it may be there nonetheless. Um, and this is just to give you an idea of the things that we may see co-occurring. Here are those characteristics of autism with language impairment, repetitive behaviors, and social deficits. And then overlapping that, we see, intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation. Maybe 50% of folks with autism also have an intellectual disability. And so that's going to affect how this all looks. And then you can see off to the side the sleep deficits or anxiety, the ADHDs, those sorts of things, seizures over here. So a lot of different things happening. There are some medical things as well related to gastrointestinal disorders or immune dysfunction. So, these are really complex individuals. And very rarely do we just see autism and that's it. So certainly, if you haven't figured it out already, there are a lot of challenges that may exist that can be a barrier to care for an individual with autism. That flight or fight mode, because we're so overwhelmed, and so our bodies sort of revert to the most fundamental response. Um, it might be that you can't get them to come out of a car or a house if we need them. May have a hard time with medical care, whether it's checking their blood pressure or cleaning a wound, getting just a routine medical exam. Caregivers can also be very overwhelmed by for many. I think there's a lot of being self-conscious about not being adequate in supporting a given individual. But of course, we can only do so much to control another person and what they're doing. So, a lot of times caregivers, especially if they haven't been taught strategies yet, may be overwhelmed as well. And then the individual can be so overwhelmed and unable to express their needs. I know, again, my son being extremely verbal and extremely bright, but if he is very overwhelmed, he may not be able to get his words out and tell you what he needs, or they may not come out in the way that is helpful. So we have to use some other strategies. So some helpful approaches to keep in mind. Certainly, if you are with someone with autism who's struggling and there's a caregiver present, please check to see uh, if they have strategies that they can help you with to help that person get calm. Follow their lead in how they communicate. And if that person doesn't have somebody with them and they seem to need support, asking if there is a trusted adult that you could contact for them. My son carries my contact information in his wallet and on a communication tool that he can use in a moment of crisis. And that way a stranger could contact me to help support him in a situation. If there's more than one of you, maybe having only one person approach, slowly using a calm voice, maybe even narrating what you're doing. I'm going to walk over and I just want to sit down next to you, right? So keeping it calm, keeping it simple. That's really important to help them process. Remember, their brains are on overload. They can maybe only process one thing at a time. So we've got to maybe keep it simple so they can process what you're saying. If you have to give a direction, ask a question, give them extra time to respond, maybe even model what you're looking them for. Like if you're giving directions, modeling what you want them to do. I will ask my son a question sometimes and he won't answer it necessarily the first time, but I'll ask it again in the same tone as I did the first time, because I don't want him to hear my voice sounding annoyed, because then he stresses out and we have a whole new problem, right? So I'm just doing it to cue his brain to help it process the words. So that's something. And then if you are communicating verbally, to be concise, use short phrases and very clear, concrete directions. So you want to avoid nicknames, you want to avoid idioms or expressions. You want to keep it really, really concrete. So making it easier to for that person to respond by not requesting eye contact. So if it is hard to talk to somebody who's not looking at you, but it's really important to not assume that they're not listening if they're not looking at you. So so do not require that they look at you. If you are asking questions, if you can ask an open-ended question rather than yes, no, you might be more likely to get, at least from somebody who can answer, has enough vocabulary. You may get more information, because otherwise they're just going to pick a 50-50 chance of getting the right information with yes, no. Of course, if somebody's cognitive ability, is much lower, then you're going to have to ask questions that they can understand the words of in the first place. And that's a different scenario. Um, if there's somebody around that has like a fidget or something they can hold that might help them feel calm, that would be good to have. You can ask them, is there something that helps you feel better? I think my son would probably answer that question. If I can watch a cat video or baby owls, that would help me feel better. If I can walk around, that would help me feel better. Um, so that would be something to ask them if they're able to identify that. Helping the environment be calm is important. So, turning off patrol car lights. If there's a crowd, asking people to back away or finding a quieter place to stand or sit. That's going to be helpful. And speaking in a calm voice, again, will be helpful. If you have to touch them, you want to give them a heads up. So I know I do this with my son a lot. If I need to touch him, I let him know. I'm going to touch your arm because I need to do this, right? And I'm just trying to help you. That would be something you want to give them a warning for, so their body can prepare to receive that touch. When we think about, I'm talking more on a medical end now, but for those of you who are might be in the EMT world, we think about communication as receptive or expressive. Receptive being what I understand, and expressive being what I can communicate to you. So, when we're thinking about us communicating to them, what language do we use? We want to make sure our words are concrete, our language is direct, and we're not using a ton of words. If we can use pictures or write things down, that's going to be really, really helpful. I remember the first time my son had a seizure and we went to the ER, and he was unconscious for a super long time. So we were in the ER, but they wanted to do a CT scan, and I think they wanted to put in an IV, and he was beginning to like come out of, he was postictal, and so I said, I need a piece of paper. Let's write down what's going to happen step by step. And I broke it down, and he could read. So I was able to make a list for him. But, so that he would cooperate and not be scared, he could see, we're going to, we're going to wipe your arm, a needle will go in, then there will be tape, and then we're going to roll on the gurney to the CT scan, whatever it was. And that, he was able to calmly, even though he was in a new place, very disoriented, something had just happened to him, just having that written down was very powerful. I remember the nursing staff being amazed at how much that helped him handle that situation. Um, and then, arranging something desirable at the end. So, first you're going to do this, but then you're going to get this. Um, and it might be something that they like. You can look at this, or here's a fidget or something, but first I need to check your blood pressure. And we can communicate that verbally, or we might do it with pictures. We might hold up, first we're going to do the blood pressure cuff, and then we're going to, you get a sucker, or you can hold the bunny, or whatever it is. And then timers and countdowns are a way for us to sort of say, all right, we're going to do this, but only for this long. And then they see when this is going to be over. So these are ways that we can communicate information to them that they can process better. For them to communicate with us, we can give them communication boards or picture cues or pain scales. These are visual representations of concepts that allow them to communicate. Again, even if they're verbal, having the support of those things may help facilitate their ability to tell you things. So, here's a pain scale. What are you feeling, or how far? Might have a picture of a body where they can point to the body part. Again, for somebody cognitively who knows their body parts. And that way, if they can't get the words out, they have another way to tell. We also can we do a lot of this where we take pictures and we can tell a story. This is the order that things will happen. And the pictures, again, just make it easier to process, especially for somebody who may not be, um, really a good reader yet. And so they still understand, here, this picture, we're going in the car, we're going to drive, and then we check in at the doctor's office and we go to the waiting room. You can read a book and you can listen to your music, and then you're going to talk to the nurse, and then we're going to go down the hall. So that's the process when we check in at the doctor's office. And again, these are the kinds of strategies we're trying to teach parents, but I can't promise you that every parent you're going to meet supporting a kid or an adult with autism has been, using these strategies. But we try to reach as many people as we can, and these are things too. Creating these to have in like a medical setting, or in a squad car, or we can have pictures of things that may come up in conversation to have them handy, could be really, really helpful. So these are other medical ones, but we're going to use, this is the oxygen or stethoscope, and so these are all the things that are going to happen. And so on the bottom half, we can say, well, first we're going to do this, and then we're done, right? So we have like options of things. And then just like I was describing, my son can read words. So I just asked for a piece of paper, but having dry erase boards handy, or Post-it notes handy, or just a pad of paper that you can write on and draw on to communicate in stressful situations is going to be really important. I have to tell you that I always have something with me now, for situations like that. For some of our folks, having something to fidget with can be really helpful in helping the brain calm down and quiet down. The quieter and calmer their brains are feeling and their bodies are feeling, the more ability they will have to communicate or process the things that you need them to process. And there are a lot of different kinds of sensory fidgety things. Please don't assume that every kid with autism wants to play with a koosh ball, or the putty. So having sort of a whole bunch of different kinds and giving them choices. I remember we went to a disability services office at a school, and they had a basket full of fidgets, and she called it hand candy. And I just thought that was a great expression. But having like options, and you got to pick which one, felt best. I think that can be really helpful. And then these are just sort of breathing methods. There's more than one of these, but I've seen the box breathing. There's actually a company that makes these sort of nubby strips that are in the shape of a box, and you just trace it with your finger. So you breathe in for 4 seconds as you'd go down one side of the box, and then hold it for 4 seconds, and then breathe out for 4 seconds. And you just keep doing that as you trace the box. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 again is a grounding technique, where you tell me 5 things you see, tell me 4 things you can touch. And again, it's almost a meditation in a way, but it can help sort of quiet the mind and refocus on things so that you can then get on with the business you need to get on with. Couple do's and don'ts to keep in mind, but it's very easy to say, this won't hurt because you just want to get it done, but they're not going to trust you if they figure out that that was not true. So resist that temptation. Explaining what is happening. We definitely want them to know what's going on. We want to keep that language simple, though. We don't want them to feel tons of uncertainty. Otherwise, you're going to find that they're going to start perseverating, or that anxiety will ratchet back up. So helping them know you're in the hospital. You had a seizure. Actually, I don't know if I told him my son had a seizure when that happened, because I don't think that was information that was helpful to him. But, you're in the hospital. I am here. You're okay. We are going to do this, and then we're going to do this. And just keeping that very simple. But avoiding words like scared or you had us worried and stuff like that. We just want to stay positive, again, concrete, and certainly want to provide positive reinforcement and compliments when it's appropriate. You're doing a good job. I like how you're able to sit, that kind of thing. When it's possible, giving them choices is going to be really helpful. It gives them a sense of autonomy and control. Again, in a world where they are not knowing what's expected of them or what's next, giving them a sense of control in ways that you can live with is very helpful. So, do you want to sit or do you want to lay down? Do you want to do this first or do you want to do that first? You don't want to give a million choices, but 2 you can live with would be good. And then, they may need a distraction if they're really, really anxious about something. So, if you find that I know my son really liked bunnies when he was little, and so we needed him to do something, and I'd be like, look, I have a bunny, and he'd be like, oh, okay. And all of a sudden we're sitting again and we could do the next thing. And then as soon as he's getting distracted and moving around, I'm like, oh, there's the bunny, and he's like, oh, bunny, and we're back at it again. So but whatever you see that is working, keep doing that. That can be very important. And then I want to talk about just language that I've used as we've been talking, but I know I want to give some time to answer some specific questions about some strategies that have been in some tougher situations you've been in. So I'll give a chance for a couple questions. But you've heard me use both people with autism or individuals with autism, and you've heard me use the words autistic. And so we have been using that language interchangeably of late. When my son was first diagnosed, we referred to people as autistic, and then there was a huge movement called the person first language movement, where we identified the person and the individual primarily, and the diagnosis as something secondary to who they are. And in recent years, adults on the spectrum have really advocated for, especially our, adults at that level 1, to say, nope, this is really who I am. I am autistic. And so a big movement toward what we call identity first language has come into the autism community. And we honor both, and really feel like, it's important to respect the individual and what they feel most comfortable with. So my son, for the most part, doesn't care, but I think given an option, he will choose person first language. At least that's what he has said when I have asked him. So my son with autism is how I refer to him. And then I'm hoping you had an opportunity already to watch the video that the Autism Society put together about 6 years ago, with the help of a program not far from where I live in Davidson, North Carolina, a program that we started 10 years ago called Ignite. And the program is, the video is not entirely about Ignite, but about interacting with people with autism and things to look for. It's kind of a recap of much of what I've covered here this evening. So, and there are additional resources available to you to learn more. Dennis DeBott specifically has some great resources on his autism risk management website. And as you're interacting with people, I'll leave you with this thought from Ann Carpenter, an adult on the spectrum. It's difficult for even a high functioning autistic adult to know exactly when to say something, when to ask for help, or when to be quiet. To such a person, life is a game in which the rules are constantly changing without rhyme or reason. So I'm going to go back to just to here to say, is that where I want to be? Yeah, so I know that we had a question about some really difficult situations. And I mean, maybe it'd be better if I just come off the slides to talk to you about some of those things so I can be really specific.
There's a few questions and comments in the chat too that I could speak to. So the same person who asked about how to help calm somebody down, he also said that he's had situations where he had to put dark tinted goggles and ear protection on a person to help downgrade the stimulation in the area, such as flashing strobing lights and sirens and vibrations.
Yeah. So again, I think about when I'm going to stop sharing. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I think that might be easier. Hey. So, when I think about individuals, who are in these really stressful situations, and I love that, those kinds of resources might have been available. I would never assume that's what somebody wants, but certainly asking and offering can be great. If somebody's in a high stress situation, I think about, and in that, the fifth question video, he talks about the fifth question, which is what is happening today that is bringing us to this difficult situation? Is this individual's routine off? Are they my son has been lost, for instance. And in that time when he was lost, he ended up, I remember he's been lost a couple times, but one of the times that he got lost, he was in college and he was looking for somebody's apartment, but he thought he knew the apartment number, but he didn't. And so he starts banging on people's doors. And you can imagine now where we're going with this, banging on people's doors in a panicked voice, about all of these, where do you know so-and-so and how do I find, and people called 911. So, I think that the officer that responded, asked him his name, asked him a couple questions, asked him where he lived, and basically just questions he could answer. And instead of helping him find a person, just helped him walk away and get back to his own dorm. And, I think that in that situation, he was upset, not because he wanted to disrupt anything, but he was scared, and he was in a new place, and that was causing the behaviors that he was exhibiting, right? He wasn't intentionally trying to bang on people's doors, and so understanding what brought this person here, you know and what is contributing to what I'm experiencing, if it's the stimulation from sensory input, but it could also be how they're thinking. And so, we look for ways to just bring it down to simple thoughts. First we're going to do this, even if it's a very bright, first, let's just walk out of the apartment building, right? That's all we're going to do. We're not going to give a lot of directions, just one direction. And then we'll give the next direction. And that's going to help bring that intensity feeling down. So
That's super advice. I have another comment here. Leanne said, can you please touch on the use of the term Asperger's? As a mom of a neurodivergent, high-functioning, low-needs child, I find this important to address.
So Asperger's syndrome was a diagnosis back before 2013. When we talk about diagnoses, we're talking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that the psychiatric community puts out. And that was revised in 2013. And what we used to consider Asperger's syndrome, which was kind of heavier on that social component, social communication component, maybe without as much of the behavior pieces, but it got folded into the autism spectrum disorder. But we will find those folks at that level 1, right? And so that's sort of where folks are housed, for lack of a better word, on the autism spectrum, when we were talking about Asperger's syndrome back then. I think there was a lot of fear that people with Asperger's syndrome would just lose their diagnosis entirely and not have a disability anymore. And I, in my experience, have not seen that happen. If anything, I feel like the way they reclassified autism spectrum disorder clarified better the diversity within the autism spectrum disorder. So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, that's great. Chris's godson uses pieces of string to help. He likes to rub it or just grab it. Oh, and Leanne had something else, and she was the one who said that last
Yeah,
comment.
my daughter gets offended because of the
Yeah.
roots of there is a lot of Asperger's, and I'm sorry, I'm familiar with Asperger, the individual, the psychiatrist who initially identified it, and his roots in history in the 40s and back then is not, it's a dark time. So yeah.
Good to know. And Elmer had asked about
So you were talking about the string.
yeah, the string. He just said that it was his godson likes to hold a piece of string or rub it or just grab onto it. It's kind of like your son with the bunny, I guess. It's just something that is familiar and comfortable. Michelle commented when you were talking about telling someone like, I'm going to touch your arm or something. She said it's a good idea to give anybody a heads up before you touch them. I thought that was really good.
It really is. And there are a lot of best practices that we associate with autism that really go a long way with everybody. And I feel like I actually use a lot of those strategies just in my day to day and working with people who don't have autism necessarily. So yeah, and I think like one of the things, and I didn't say this before, and it's worth saying that when somebody is in distress and doing things that are very disruptive as a result and really inconvenient for everybody around them, If we say to them as support people, if we say, you need to stop doing that, it doesn't get them to stop.
Mm.
But when we say, I see that you're upset, what can I do to help you? That means that they have effectively, with their behavior, communicated to you that they need help in some way.
Mm.
And now they don't need to do that as much anymore because you got it and you're there to help. And I think you're all helpers.
Mm.
And so when we say that, it lowers, it works for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons. It's not just an autism thing, but I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, I
When
think it's
and I think about that in my own personal experience,
yeah,
to be able to say, I get it. I see that you're upset. I'm going to help you figure out a way to make this work,
yeah, I like that.
even if I
Elmer,
don't figure it out.
but at least you're trying, right?
But I'm trying, right?
Yeah.
It goes a long way.
Elmer
Just
was curious if there was such a thing as an emergency first aid kit specifically designed to help those with autism. And then Stan Latta posted several links up there. So one from the Autism Foundation, Operation Safety Net, from the National Autism Association, Big Red Safety Box, and for North Carolina Autism Society, Be Prepared, Carry an Autism Survival Kit. So are
yeah.
you familiar with those, and
Yeah, so
what kind
I
of
mean,
things
these
would be
kits are
fun?
out there. I don't know exactly what's in each one.
Mhm.
Some people will put together some simple visuals with pictures as well in a first then board and um, fidgets and things like that. I think, you know, those are very specific or specialized items that might be helpful, especially when somebody's ability to communicate and understand language is limited. And so that can be really helpful. Whereas someone like my son, a sticky note and you write a couple things on it is good enough. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that everybody's communication, like the pictures that a given individual is used to using, can be um, it can vary from person to person. So, there are some basic, like you saw those black line pictures. Um, they're often from a program called Board Maker that are pretty standard, like in schools and things like that.
Mhm.
So that would be, a good place to start at least.
Yeah.
So having a few of those things handy, I think, is good.
Yeah, it's the same. So we teach preparedness for everyone, and if you and I each made an emergency kit, we're going to have different things in them. We'll have a lot of the same basic things, but then maybe I take a prescription medication that you don't take, so it will be in my kit, but it wouldn't be in
Right.
your kit. So you want to personalize those, no matter who the person is that the kit is for.
Yeah.
Um, Maggie had asked for the links that you had mentioned, and I think Michelle, she put up the link to the YouTube video. I will also send that out to everybody, so to make
Yeah.
sure that everybody gets that.
Yeah, if you
Um,
haven't watched it, just a word, you'll see that in our video, if you haven't watched it already, that uh, that it's it features some sort of mock traffic stops, and
mm,
we are quite aware that those are not kind of how it goes down.
okay.
They were really meant to be practice for the individuals with autism
Mm,
in being approached by somebody in a uniform when they're in their car.
sure.
And you see very stilted, scripted, canned type answers because they were practicing. And not all the answers were the things that they actually practiced when it came out of their mouths.
Oh,
But we included it in the video. So
oh, well, that's good.
it's good to
Um,
see. I saw a few
Leanne,
more comments come in.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. So Leanne said in prolonged natural disasters like a hurricane, earthquake, or evacuation, can you recommend what may be best practices during the event? And it could be especially challenging because we can't always guarantee when the event may end.
Right. I think we just have to, I'm going to be right here with you, right?
Mm,
So we can't, you don't want to overpromise, and that's a really important thing, right? You do want to
Sure.
make promises of things that you can't do or deliver on. But what can you do? I'm going to hold your hand, right? If it's a situation that would work. Of course, if it's prolonged over days and days and days, obviously we're not going to hold somebody's hand for days and days and days. But but maybe we will find a way to give them some certainty about what's going to happen. Um, and make a visual representation of, what when we'll get to do something that is familiar. And when we don't know what's certain, when we don't know anything, I mean, we just went through this in North Carolina.
Yeah.
We had a lot of families, my colleague that works in our Asheville office, um, no power, no water. And her son has intellectual disability as well as autism. And he's an adult and they had supports, visual supports. I think one of the good uh, reasons for using what I would call low tech, which is pictures versus device based visual information, is that low tech doesn't require batteries or
Yeah.
electricity to be able to use. Um, and, we can line objects up to say, we get 3 water bottles today, and here's one, and we're going to have a timer, and then this is the time when we have the next one, and then this is and so I'm always thinking about how can I infuse, like, we use the term visual structure into this situation.
Mhm.
How can I make this idea more concrete? And we may have to, if there's a disaster and we've lost a lot of things, we're going to have to use what we have at hand.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great thing. I think we got through all the comments and we are right at an hour and a half, just a little over. And I certainly appreciate your time. This has been very educational, I think, for all of us, and really appreciate you being here. Um, does anybody have any very last minute things? Because I know we don't want to keep Nancy until midnight or anything. So I think we had a lot of great comments and then questions in the chats. You're getting a lot of thank yous, and it was absolutely fantastic.
Okay.
So yes, thank you so much, Nancy. It was really great, and
Well,
I think
it's
it'll
my
help us
pleasure.
all, as we're out in the community helping folks. We want to be sure we're helping everyone in a way that they want to be helped. So I think you've really given us some tools tonight to be able to do that.
Well, I hope so. And just know that, the Autism Society is here. If you ever have a question and you want, some help, that's what we're here for. And you're welcome to reach out to us. There's a
Awesome.
lot of different portals on our website. They're really easy to get to helpers.
Great. Great. Well, thank you again, and thanks to everybody who showed up. Appreciate y'all being here, and we will talk to you all soon. Everybody have a great night and stay safe.
Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you
Thanks,
for having
Nancy.
me.
Absolutely. Good night.
Good night.